Hi, my name is TARUN and welcome to a British Audiophile, another video in my Hi-Fi tip series. This video is about how to choose an amplifier, specifically how I would go about choosing an amplifier. Now, the reason I'm doing this video is that I quite regularly get asked in the comment section from my viewers for advice about what speaker they should be considering or what amplifier they should be considering. It's quite difficult for me to give specific advice because I don't know your room, your setup, your musical tastes, or what you're trying to achieve from your system. But I try my best to give people a general steer where I can. These are things that I have covered before on this channel in an earlier series, and in fact in an earlier episode of this series I covered speaker selection. So if you haven't seen that video, I'd urge you to see that first, because I think you should really start by choosing your speakers first. So we're going to cover amplifier selection from a fresh perspective in this video. Let's get started. Right, so I should mention that this series is aimed at people who are really looking to get into this hobby or getting started in this hobby. I'm going to try and keep things as non-technical as possible. I would welcome seasoned audiophiles to watch as well and share their advice in the comment section. And I'm going to assume that you've watched my previous video in this series about selecting speakers. Selecting a pair of speakers that's going to work well in your room and that you're happy with the sound is by far the most important thing to get right first. So choose your pair of speakers. Once you're happy with those, select an amplifier that's got the features that you need and that's going to work well with those pair of speakers. Let's take a look at what's inside an amplifier. If you're getting started in this hobby, the likelihood is you're going to be looking at an integrated amplifier. Now, this Hagel H160 is an integrated amplifier, and what that means is that the preamplifier and the power amplifier are in one box. The preamplifier is what allows you to adjust the volume up and down and choose between different inputs, and the power amplifier is what drives your speakers. The power amplifier itself can be broken down into two parts. There's the voltage gain stage, and then there's the current driving stage. That's the bit that drives your speakers, but we won't get into that in this particular video. So if you're looking at a modern integrated amplifier, the likelihood is that it's also got an inbuilt DAC. That's a digital to analog converter. It takes the digital signal from your streamer or your CD player, converts it into an analog signal that you can then power and then use that to drive your speakers. So you want to make sure that you've got the right kind of digital connections that you need. I use 3 digital connections on this Hagel H160. I use basically the USB output of my Auralic Aries streamer into the USB input of the Hagel. I use a coax basically connection to connect to my Blu-ray player and an optical connection to connect to my TV, which is over here. So those are the 3 types of typical digital connection you have, and I use all 3 for connecting to my digital sources. That's digital sources, but there are also analog sources. Analog sources are things like cassette decks, reel-to-reel players. You may have an old VCR, or more likely a turntable. Now, a turntable is a special case scenario. If you want to connect a turntable to your amplifier, you need a phono stage, either an external one or an inbuilt phono stage. Now, if you're looking at an integrated amplifier with an inbuilt phono stage, I'll just illustrate by showing you on this IOTA VX SA3. So your normal line level inputs, these are your normal analog connections. If your amplifier, I should say, has an inbuilt phono stage, one of these connectors will be labeled phono, and you'll connect it like you would any other line level input, but they also have a ground connection, which it has here to connect to your turntable as well. Now, what's special about turntables are that the signal that comes off a turntable is much weaker than the normal line level input. So it requires a extra stage of amplification and equalization to bring it up to line level. And that's essentially what the inbuilt phono stage does. Now, it used to be the case that if you wanted a cost-effective solution, the only option available to you was an integrated amplifier. But for a few reasons, that is no longer the case, especially if you don't need analog inputs. I'll just illustrate. This is the IOTA VX SA3 amplifier that I recently reviewed on this channel, and this retails in the UK for £400. It's a power amplifier, a preamplifier. It has a built-in DAC and a built-in phono stage. There's no doubt that if you want the convenience of one box, this is the way to go. But those of you who follow this channel will know that there is an alternative. This is the matching power amplifier, the PA3. It retails for £100 less, £299. And there's no preamplifier, there's no phono stage, there's no DAC. It seems on paper at least you get more for your money with the integrated. But those of you who follow this channel will know that when I reviewed these two products, the power amplifier in this sounded a little bit better than the power amplifier in the integrated, even though they're identical. And the reason is that the components in here, especially the power supply components, do not have to share duties. They basically are dedicated purely for the power amplifier. There's also a sonic benefit from removing the sensitive preamplifier and DAC stages away from the kind of powerhouse juggernaut which is the power amplifier. So you could purchase this. And the other thing that's changed in recent years is that high performance DACs have become a lot more affordable. So you could buy something like this SMSL M300 that I also recently reviewed on this channel. This retails on Amazon for £213. So the combination of this DAC and the power amplifier is about £113 more than the integrated. The DAC inside this SMSL 300 is far better than the DAC inside the IOTA VX. And the other thing that's changed in recent years is that previously the volume control, which was done digitally, was done by something called bit reduction. When they reduced the volume, they used to basically throw away bits and reduce resolution. That is no longer the case. Modern DACs use the DSP engine in the chip to basically reduce the volume, and they do a very, very good job in terms of digital volume controls, arguably a lot better than the analog volume controls that you get in kind of integrated amplifiers at this price point. So for my money, in terms of performance sonically, I think this is the way I would go: a dedicated DAC with a digital volume control and a dedicated power amplifier. I want to talk about amplifier power and the perception that some people have that a higher powered amplifier is automatically better than a lower powered amplifier, and that simply isn't the case. The power of your amplifier purely determines how loud your loudspeakers will play. Now, if you're interested in finding out a little bit about how many watts you actually use, I'll link to a video in the description notes that I did on amplifier power that will walk you through a rough calculation. You may be surprised to find out that you probably don't use anywhere near as many watts as you think you use when you're running your speakers. Most people listening in small or medium living spaces at kind of sensible listening levels with moderately efficient speakers will probably get away with 50 watts. If you've got a large room, really inefficient speakers, or you listen at kind of rock concert levels, you may well need 100 watts. There's very few people who need much more than that. So if it's not about watts, what is it about, if you'll forgive the pun? Well, it's really about your amplifier's ability to deliver peaks of current when it's demanded from the loudspeakers. Now I'm going to break this down as simply as I possibly can, and I may have to oversimplify, so Those engineering bods out there, please bear with me. Now let's take a loudspeaker that has an 8 ohm nominal impedance. Now for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call that the average load of the loudspeaker. The reality is the load of the loudspeaker changes with frequency. It may be 8 ohms, but there'll be points where, say for example, a kick drum hits the load. Let's say it drops from 8 ohms to 4 ohms. That's a halving of the load. What it's demanding from your amplifier is a doubling of the watts at that point, and specifically a doubling of the current that's delivered to the loudspeaker. The ability of your loudspeaker to do, the ability of your amplifier to do that is determined by the quality of the power supply. Now let's talk about Class AB amplifiers. That will be determined by the size of the power transformer inside that and the amount of filter capacitance that you have. The bigger the transformer, the more filter capacitance that you have, the greater the ability of the amplifier to basically deliver more current when it's needed. Class D amplifiers are a little bit different because they have switch mode power supplies generally, and they're pretty good at driving low impedance loads. So what you'd look for is in an amplifier is the rating at 8 ohms, and ideally you want it to double into 4 ohms. Now that won't be the case with inexpensive amplifiers. You may have a 50 watt amplifier that's rated at 8 ohms that may only go up to 70 watts into 4 ohms. More expensive amplifiers will be able to get closer to doubling their output, and the very expensive amplifiers out there will certainly be able to do that. So that's something that is an important characteristic. The peak current capability of your amplifier is an important specification that most manufacturers don't publish, which is a real shame. Inexpensive amplifiers may have a peak current capability of maybe 8 or 10 amps, and more expensive amplifiers may be 15 or 20 amps, and when you're really getting on to kind of like the big boys, big power amplifiers, they may be able to deliver 40 or even 60 amps at a push. So that, as I say, is determined by the quality of the power supply. I mentioned Class AB and Class D amplifiers, so I should talk a little bit about amplifier topology. There are valve amplifiers and Class A amplifiers, but those typically tend to be high-end solutions where efficiency isn't a main consideration and they're going for out-and-out sound quality. The vast majority of amplifiers that people are going to come across when they're getting started in this hobby are Class AB or Class D. I'm not one of those audiophiles that gets hung up on one topology being better than the other. I've heard a bunch of amplifiers from both Class AB and Class B that sound good, and also Class AB and Class D amplifiers that don't sound good. So it really is all about implementation. If you're looking at a Class AB amplifier, the benefit is that it's an established technology. It's been around for donkey's years. Manufacturers have it well figured out and they know how to make that sound good. But it requires large transformers and filter capacitors, and those are expensive parts. Class D gets around that because they use transformers that they switch on and off very quickly at high frequencies. That makes them much more efficient. You don't need big transformers and big capacitors, and the reality is that you can get away with a very small light box. So don't dismiss a Class D amplifier just because it's in a small box. The problem with Class D amplifiers are that switching of transistors at high frequencies generates a lot of noise, and that has to be filtered out. And if it's not filtered out effectively, it can adversely affect the sound. Like I say, I don't get particularly hung up on one topology sounding better than the other. I think it's a question of how well designed it is, and they're both good solutions. The last thing I think is important to consider when you're choosing an amplifier to work well with a pair of speakers that you own is the synergy between your amplifier and your speakers. There are certain combinations that work really well together. And how are you going to figure that out in this day and age where dealers are few and far between and it's really difficult to get your hands on gear and audition? Well, the reality is you're going to have to do your homework. Look at reviews, whether you read them or watch them online, from sources that you respect, and get a sense of what they think may work well together. Also, there's a bunch of videos on YouTube alone from manufacturers demoing their gear. They're not daft, they know how to showcase their products to their best ability and see what they're using. So if you're looking at KEF speakers, you'll regularly see them with Arcam or Hagel amplifiers. You'll regularly see Wharfedale with Audiolab or NAD with PSB. Now I know that some of those come from the same stable, that's why they audition together, but generally if they come from the same stable, they work well together as well. Those combinations do tend to work out quite well. And once you've gone through that process, you should hopefully, along with the other criteria I mentioned, be able to get down to a few amplifiers on your shortlist. Ideally, get down to 3 amplifiers and try and audition all of those 3 amplifiers at home with your speakers. Make sure you can return them and pick the one that suits you best. So hopefully this has answered a few questions that people ask me from time to time about how to maybe narrow down the choice of amplifiers, and it's been useful to some of you out there. If you like this video, please hit the like button, please share it, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.